Hi, everyone. Welcome to our Trade and Geopolitics session of the Virtual Ag Outlook Conference presented by Northwest Farm Credit Services. I'm Crystal Kidd with the Business Management Center, and I'll be your facilitator for today's one-hour program. We're sure glad you made time to join us today. If you've been with us for our previous Ag Outlook sessions, you'll know we've covered a lot of ground with presentations on megatrends in agriculture, weather insights, and politics in the economy. And if you missed those, check out our website for the recordings. We hope today's session can provide insight into one more important piece of the puzzle for agriculture and global trade. We are missing seeing you in person at these events that are typically held throughout the Pacific Northwest this time of year, but we're excited we can still bring these presentations and expert insights to you through the magic of technology and without the travel required. We appreciate your flexibility and willingness to join us online for our programs this year. Today's presentation is being recorded and will be posted to our website within the coming week, and all participants have been muted upon entry. If you experience technical issues, please use the chat box to let us know, or you can get in touch with our team using the contact information provided in your reminder email. We'll also be posting the call-in number in the chat box in the event you experience audio issues and prefer to switch over to a telephone connection rather than your computer. With our housekeeping items out of the way, let's get started with our program. I know there's a number of people that are excited to see Peter online today. We're excited to welcome geopolitics strategist Peter Zeihan. Peter combines a deep understanding of geography, demography, energy, and trade to help his clients make sense of a complicated world, and boy, is it ever complicated right now. Over the course of his career, Peter has worked for the U.S. State Department in Australia, the D.C. think tank community, and helped develop the analytical models for Stratfor, one of the world's premier private intelligence companies. He regularly provides expertise to Fortune 500 companies, trade associations, policymakers, and government agencies at all levels. Peter's also a critically acclaimed author, and his first two books, The Absent Superpower and The Accidental Superpower, have been recommended by the likes of Mitt Romney and Ian Bremmer. His latest book, Disunited Nations, became available in March 2020, so be sure to check that out. We will have time at the end of the presentation for questions, so please submit those to us using the chat box, and we'll cover them at that time. With that, I'll turn things over to Peter to give us the lay of the land. Peter, it's all yours.
What we're going to do today is talk about a lot of things that are probably going to make us all very uncomfortable. So let's start with something that we all agree on. Let's start with politics. Here we've got the outcome of the elections by demographic voting block. And I want you to look at a couple things in particular. So this is the percentage of the people who voted for Trump. Subtract that number from 100, you get the percent that voted for Biden. But start with this. Vermont and Wyoming were the two states that were most extreme in the way they favored one candidate over the other. And we all know Wyoming, they're like 1/2 of the population are working cowboys. And we all know that in Vermont, they're like can barely tolerate Bernie Sanders because he's just so conservative. But even there, 30% of the population voted for the other guy. This isn't a significant statistical shift from where we've been for the last 60 years. So it's not that the population has split into these horribly at odds voting blocks. It's that our perception has changed, and that's largely an issue of social media. More importantly, look at the green area. And now those are some huge voting blocks, but this is the difference between 56% and 44%. This is an 11-9 split. Is it statistically significant? Sure, that's how elections are decided. But with all these people in that green zone, this is not exactly what I would consider a nation that's at its own throat. Now, just because we're not nearly as divided as the noise suggests doesn't mean that our political system is not in flux, because, oh, baby, it is. Now, I showed you guys this about 3 years ago. It shows how we've got factions of factions that make up our voting system. It's not that one group controls the whole block. It's a series of groups that jostle for power. And the reason that the Republicans have traditionally tended to dominate in the last 70 years at the national level in particular is that their list of factions, business, national security, evangelical populace, and so on, they don't contradict one another. Their core issues do not argue among themselves. But that's not how it works for the Democrats. It's a much looser coalition. It has more members, more voters. But any time a candidate tries to run on the issues, it sparks a fight among the factions, and entire groups just don't show up to vote. And then two groups in the middle. So that's how it used to be. With the presidential election 4 years ago, this is how things actually shook out. And what that tells me is that the factional alliances that we used to rely upon to understand our political system, they're gone. And we need to look at this a little differently. So a simple 2x2 graphic. If you're to the right, you're an economic conservative and you want the government out of your pocketbook. If you're at the top, you're a social liberal and you want the government out of your personal life. If you're on the left, you're an economic liberal and you think that the government should reach into your pocketbook in order to shape society in some way. And if you're down at the bottom, you're a social conservative and you think the government should play a role in regulating social morality. Now, we're all somewhere on this, but those factions tend to fall in some very clear patterns. So here we've got our traditional swing voters. They tend to be economically liberal. They're okay with a little redistribution, but they also want the government to play a role in regulating private life. Here's the Democratic coalition, all over the map, and here's the Republican coalition. Now, here's everybody at the same time. Now, what is going on right now is that in terms of number of voters, the Republican Party has expanded. The Republicans have specifically and traditionally treated one of their groups, the populace, as kind of a vote bank, someone to ignore, but they'll show up in certain numbers. What Trump has done is brought that group in from the cold and gotten a lot of populists who had written off the political system to be involved again. And they are now very large and very in charge of the party. But that came at a cost, because this new populist super bloc within the coalition is clashing with the pre-existing power blocks, kind of in the way that the Democratic Party has tended to work. Specifically, between the populist and national security and business and fiscal leaders, there's where the problem is. And it's not a coincidence. I think of the national security and the business and the fiscal communities as kind of the math and maps crowd. And if there's something that we've learned about Trump is that he finds context boring and non-supportive facts infuriating. So unsurprisingly, Trump's method of communication tends to grind on the math and maps crowd. And unsurprisingly, never-Trumpers, as well as those Republicans who have broken ranks with the president on the issue of election fraud, are mostly from those three groups. Trump has been very successful at purging national security members, business members, and fiscal voters from his administration, from Congress, and from the Republican Party. These three factions are now swing voters. Trump has also successfully courted other groups who are expressly not math or maps oriented because they have similar views of culture to his core supporters. So Trump was wildly successful at capturing the unions. You see, I'm just switching them to red. Now, the day that the Democrats voted to impeach Trump, you remember back that a year ago? The president of the AFL-CIO Union Alliance was actually in the White House to publicly laud the new NAFTA Accord. Needless to say, that triggered a bit of a panic attack at Democratic Party headquarters. Next, the Catholics. The general social conservative trend for evangelicals has affected the Catholic community as well, and has split it down the middle. Those that remain religious have gone super conservative, and those that have not have gone super secular. So what remains is a smaller group of conservatives, but a much more Trump-friendly block of voters. Third are the Hispanics. They are, by far, the most socially conservative voting bloc in the United States. And the issue that they are most conservative on is immigration. They like the idea of family reunification, but only for their families. Besides that, they don't just want a wall, they want to patrol the wall. Trump actually won most of the most Hispanic districts in the country, including on the Texas-Mexican border. So this is the new Republican coalition. This is what the party looks like right now. Now, what's going on with the Democrats is very much in motion. So this is a little bit more projective than it is analytical. But Trump's purge of the math and maps crowd from the Republicans have left the business community in the wind. Now, Biden's cabinet picks suggest that he is making a bid for including them in the new Democratic coalition. That would leave this new Democratic Party with all of the money. It would be an awkward coalition, of course, with business and socialists under the same tent, right? The socialists are out. Not only did Biden beat this faction soundly in the primaries and then repudiate them in the debates, not only did Obama come out from retirement to put some bullets in the foreheads of some people's political futures, but Biden's selection of Kamala Harris as his VP candidate infuriated the hard left. She wasn't just a district attorney. She was a DA famous for putting a lot of people in prison. On law and order issues, Harris is more conservative than most old-school Vietnam-era Republicans. Now, I'm sure some of you are like, whoa, what about the protests? What about Portland? Well, what about Portland? This is exactly what it looks like. This is Darth Vader riding a unicycle while playing a flame-throwing bagpipes. Portland should never be your litmus test as what passes for normal, nor should you ever consider it representative of anywhere. Portland is no more the United States than Disney World is. Just ask any of the people who are on this call who are actually from Oregon. They'll have all kinds of stories why Portland is strange. And in fact, if you factor out a single week in Minneapolis when this all began, and Portland, of course, what we've seen with the protests honestly haven't been violent or all that large. It's just that due to coronavirus, we've all been starved of interaction and information, and so whatever comes across our screens gets a lot more attention than normal. Is it important? Sure. Can addressing it, and by that I mean everything from racial issues to police policies to Antifa to the Proud Boys. Can addressing all of that improve our nation? Absolutely. But perspective remains important. So what we're looking at is that this might be the new Democratic coalition. And if that plays true, blacks will become a vote bank akin to how the Republicans used to treat populists. That will cause political heartburn down the road. And then military and fiscal voters become the new swing voters. This appears to be where we're moving. Now, there's plenty of time for it to all shake out, but we are now in year 5 of what is traditionally a 5 to 12-year transition process. It makes sense that we're seeing some of the outlines of the new political future structures. Now, I don't want anyone to get overly dejected or frustrated or enthusiastic about this. Politics evolve. They follow changes in culture and economics and technology and geopolitics. It's a feature of the system, not a bug. Politically, we are dealing with the after effects of the end of the Cold War, the rise of the digital age, and the dawn of mass deglobalization. Of course, we are going to manage our political system differently. And it's not just us. Every democracy in the world is doing this in some way. Hell, 3 years ago, the French equivalent of both their Republicans and their Democratic parties completely imploded, and they're still sifting through the wreckage. We will get through this. It'll be loud, it'll be uncomfortable, but we'll get through it. In the meantime, it is functionally, politically, and culturally impossible for the United States to play a stabilizing role in global affairs. In fact, it's militarily impossible as well. If you're going to manage the global system, you have to have troops everywhere to enforce the peace, to ensure freedom of the seas, to prevent your allies from going to war with one another. Well, we can't do that anymore. This is total American deployments abroad since World War II. You'll notice that it's been trending down for some time. We now have fewer troops stationed abroad than at any time since the 1920s. Maintaining global order is no longer in the cards because we don't have the force footprint. Americans haven't simply decided to abandon the world. We've already left. Globalization is over. What's left is running on inertia, which means that any trade relationship that requires global security is at best suspect. There's also a question of whether the numbers would work anyway. Now, this is a standard demographic: children on the bottom, young adults, mature adults, retirees at the top, men on one side, women on the other. This is Mexico. This is what we call a consumption-led system. And when American policymakers look at something like this, when American business leaders look at something like this, we love what we see. Young Mexicans are the consumers. Anyone over 40, it's all about the spending, the kids and the cars and the college and the homes. And so they absorb a lot of American goods. And the things that they're good at, young people, assembly, low-end manufacturing, that's not what Americans excel at. We do the design, we do the high end. So the propensity for trade between those systems is massive. Mexico became our largest trading partner last year. It is a position they will not give up in our lives. This is a partner, and this is not. The Koreans had a baby bust 50 years ago. They never recovered. They now have a lot of people in their 50s and early 60s, folks who are very good at their jobs, very high value added, producing a lot of stuff that goes head to head with American worker output. But there aren't any young Koreans, so that stuff has to be exported. This is a country we will never have a trade surplus with. Now, from the global point of view, from roughly 1980 to 2015, we were in the perfect moment, demographically speaking, because all of the world's economies were either consumption-led like Mexico or export-led like Korea. And with the Americans holding up the ceiling and anyone being able to sell anything anywhere at any time, everyone could trade and everyone could grow. And it was the fastest period of economic growth in human history. It was a perfect balance. But 20 years later, we are all 20 years older. And that tells me that the global demographic of high consumption was already ending. As to the export-led economies, they were all aging into mass retirement in kind of a post-growth system. And the year that all of this flipping was going to happen is really 2022, which pretty much every economy in the world was going to switch this decade anyway, but it's all front-loaded. Now, for the United States, it's not great, but it's not awful. Now, our baby boomer cadre is unique among the world, not because they're big, but because they had kids. And so say what you will about the millennials, and there's so very much we can say about the millennials. They exist, and their consumption today is our single biggest driver of growth. And in a few years, as they edge into their 40s and 50s, their savings will power the system as well. But very few other countries have that. Let me give you an idea of scale. This is the GDP of the consumption-led economies in the world today, stacked up. And if you fast forward a decade, here's where they're going to be. So a moderate decline, not a good sign. But it's nothing compared to what's going to happen to the export-led systems. They're just aging into mass retirement. Now, today, we only have one country that has already made that transition, Japan. But if you look forward a decade, folks, this is it. Global consumption has peaked. Global production has peaked. And neither are going to recover in our lifetimes. And that was before coronavirus. What we've got here is per capita new cases of coronavirus on a 7-day moving average. And since they're per capita, they're broadly cross-comparable. We've got the 4 big American states, Pennsylvania, New York, Texas, and Florida, as well as a couple within your guys' neighborhood. Now, the double red arrow, the pointed at 5 per 100,000 per day, that's kind of the threshold that epidemiologists identify as when the virus becomes endemic in the population. And when it's endemic, the only 2 ways that you can beat it are to have a multi-month hard lockdown, harder than anything we've done yet, or have a functional vaccine. So we are stuck with this until the vaccine is done. Now, our national inability to manage this epidemic, and I don't just mean criticism of Trump or the federal administration, I mean at the state level, at the city level, at the private level, universities, everybody has screwed this up. It means we're stuck with this. And economically, that means the coronavirus recession is no longer a one-off, but instead a deep impacting event affecting every economic sector. It's become a normal recession, and it still has 9 months to go. That means the shifts in consumption patterns that we've been suffering through all have legs. For agriculture, it's pretty obvious and pretty straightforward. If people are not eating at restaurants, and restaurants are responsible for almost half the food sales in the United States, it means that consumption patterns have changed. Less bacon, less steaks, less cheese. They're eating at home, cheaper things, ground beef, chicken. We have another 3 quarters of this. So let me give you an idea of what to expect. This is data from the COVID tracking project, which by far has the best data out there. First section is new tests. Second is new positive cases. Third is total number of people hospitalized. And fourth is deaths per day. So first, this was our first outbreak, primarily focused on New York City. That's the first wave. We had no meaningful testing, and we had no idea how to treat it. Fatality rates were high. It totally sucker punched New York City. Then we had a gap as New York City lockdown got it under control, but the virus spread elsewhere. And by the time we got to early summer, midsummer maybe, we had a second peak, this time in California, Florida, Texas, and the South. But total hospitalizations were the same. Cases were more than double, but hospitalizations were the same. But more importantly, the total deaths were half. So the death rate dropped by 3/4. Why? Well, we had better treatments. We knew more. We knew not to put people on ventilators unless you have a choice. And the outbreak was physically spread out, so we didn't have everyone trying to cram into the same hospital. More importantly, between the broad geographic spread, big but not everywhere, meant that traveling nurses could go from places with low infection rates to places with high infection rates. So hospitals were pushed to the limit, but none broke. Now, we're in a new situation. The outbreak is in all 50 states, and it's pretty bad in all of them. The positivity rate for COVID tests is now so high that the new cases we're discovering are probably underreporting what's actually out there by at least a factor of 6. We now have twice as many people hospitalized as the previous waves. All the traveling nurses have already been contracted, which means that today 1/3 of the American population already lives in zones where the hospitals are already full, and we have not yet seen the Thanksgiving surge manifest. In the case of non-minor cases, COVID tends to last 3 to 4 weeks. So yes, that means we're looking at over 1 million new cases a day. And yes, that means that most people who get seriously ill from this point on will not get nearly as good critical care because there won't be enough room. But most importantly, as the hospitals fill, it means the quality of care declines, and that means the death rate goes up. So we're going to go from this 0.3 to 0.5% that we became used to over the summer to something closer to the 1 to 2% that we saw in the spring. So yes, that means that yesterday, for the first time in the epidemic, more people died of coronavirus than in the 9/11 attacks. And we will be at or above that number until at least New Year's. The chance of dying of COVID in your part of the country is now probably about 1 in 1,000, and the odds are getting worse. Now, I know 1 in 1,000 doesn't sound like much, but consider this. In about 2 weeks, more Americans are likely to die in a single day from COVID than all Americans in all locations who have been killed from all types of terror attacks in the last quarter century. And that number will hold for weeks. This is our new normal until we have a vaccine. Luckily, on that topic, I have some unabashedly good news. Now, the term that we're after is herd immunity. I'm sure you've heard of it. Combined with those who have already caught and survived coronavirus, we need at least 60% of the population to get inoculated to reach it. On this front, things look good. The Pfizer and the Moderna vaccines will probably be approved within a week, and we already have enough vaccine in stores to provide all health care workers in the United States with their shots by the end of the first week of January. Distribution is getting easier too. We thought originally we were going to need -94, but that number keeps coming down as they get more experience. So Pfizer needs -70. Moderna only needs -20. We also have a third vaccine, Oxford, that will likely be approved by the end of January. Even better, Johnson & Johnson is coming. And that, I like because it doesn't require a freezer at all, just a refrigerator, and it's a one-shot vaccine instead of a 2. That will probably be available in February. So we'll use Pfizer and Moderna for the big point immunizations, hospitals, care homes, large employers. We'll start that now. Most rural regions will probably end up using the J&J formula. All in all, mass immunization of the general public is likely to begin by April 1. And we will probably reach that 60% inoculation figure sometime in early June. So COVID gets bottled up by the end of Q2, and the economy and those weird pricing trends that are our current normal will repair themselves over the summer. There's a light at the end of the tunnel. It's bright, it's real, it's not a train. That's the good news. The bad news is it might be too late for everybody else because the U.S. isn't alone. Same data set as before, but this time by country, and I'm showing the world's 6 largest consumption-led systems. So the United Kingdom, the United States, France, Brazil, Mexico, and India. Now, we all know in the United States, United Kingdom, and France that our numbers are underreported by at least half, probably significantly under. But it's even a bigger gap when it comes to developed countries. So again, we're all well above that 5-point. Of the world's top 20 consumption-led systems, all of them except for Australia are experiencing a coronavirus health crisis, which has crushed their consumption. So the consumption-led economies are offline, and we're all desperately trying to bring our production needs in-house for reasons of health and national security and populism and jobs, which means if you're an export-led economy, you have no one to sell to, and you won't for over a year. And then we're out of transition time. This is it. It's over. Most countries will never return to where they were in 2019. Now, if the Americans are leaving, the question is whether or not the Chinese can step forward and take control of the oceans and maintain a different trade system. There's all kinds of reasons why that's not going to happen, but let's talk about some of the big ones. First of all, the Navy. I'm sure you've all heard the scuttlebutt that the Chinese have a huge Navy that's actually, in terms of number of ships, bigger than the American Navy. This is the Shandong. This is their new aircraft carrier. And there's some truth to that. They do have a lot of ships, but to be perfectly blunt, sometimes it is about size. The United States has 10 carriers, the size of the Shandong. They're the core of our Marine Expeditionary Units. The United States, in addition, has 11 super carriers, each of which independently has at least 5 times the capacity of the Shandong. So there's no version of the Chinese Navy that can project power more than 1,000 miles from shore. In fact, most of their ships can't even make it that far, much less go global. So that is just silly. But the numbers behind the demographics are anything even sillier. Here's China's demographics in 1980 when the first child policy had a decade to get going. You can see how it's kind of cut out the bottom of that system. And if you fast forward 20 years, China was at this point kind of in that magical moment with the rest of the world. They had a lot of young people, which made their production costs low, but that's now over. They had a lot of young adults with few kids. And if you spend your money on condos and cars and pizzas, it generates a lot more follow-on growth than if you do it on preschool and diapers. So they had this period where there's this huge consumption pulse that was really, really impressive. But now that's over. And third, they cannibalized the countryside to fuel urban activity. Now, in the United States, we did the same thing. Over 200 years, 7 generations. The Chinese did it in 35 years, 1 generation. And you can only do that once. So the Chinese countryside today is pretty much denuded of people of reproductive age. So here's where we are now. China's not only aged out of its demographic moment, it is now aged past the point of even theoretical demographic recovery. And that impacts everything else. First, let's talk wages. The Chinese labor force is already contracting. So here are the monthly wages of a few Southeast Asian states that I think are actually going to do very well in the chaos to come. Here's Mexico, my number one fave, right in the middle, very competitive. And here's the PRC. 11-fold increase in labor costs in 20 years. It's the fastest climb in labor costs in human history. It means that China can no longer function as a low-cost or even a mid-cost manufacturing center. They don't have the skill set to do the high-end stuff. But as much as it's hurting them on their competitiveness side, it's even worse when it comes to consumption. When a country industrializes and urbanizes, the first 3 things that everybody wants are the same. They want a cell phone, they want a refrigerator, and they want a car. Here are car sales in China for month-on-month from a year earlier. Now, I would urge you to ignore that big drop in January of 2000. That's the year China went into a coronavirus. I'm sorry, that's the month that China went into a coronavirus lockdown. I don't think you should judge anyone at their worst moment, but look at the 2 years previous. This is supposedly when China is rising up to own the world and is going to consume all of its own stuff. Yeah, that's not in the data at all. And it's simple math. Most people purchase their first car in their 20s. China has 40% fewer 20-somethings than it has 30-somethings. And the generations are getting smaller year by year. Bottom line, the sell to China play is nearly over. In part in reaction to these trends, propaganda out of China has gotten downright hateful. Punitive trade actions to punish anyone for saying anything that's even remotely not glowingly pro-Chinese, blaming everybody and their uncle for coronavirus, being in general an asshat with absolutely everyone. It's not an accident, and it isn't purely for the domestic audience. The propaganda is expressly designed to generate a backlash to help justify the Communist Party's political crackdown at home, and not just in Hong Kong and not just in Xinjiang. Part and parcel of the Chinese breaking them off from the broader system is that the CCP will never again purchase any American foodstuffs unless there are no other options on the market. Now, the Chinese market, in my opinion, was never the promised land that many thought. It was always running on a sugar high. It was always going to flare out. But now, for political reasons in China, this market is closing until such time as China itself breaks. And producers in the United States simply just need to come to terms with that. Trade relations are going to get worse with pretty much everyone. Now, Trump's trade goal for his administration was to rewire our relationships for a new era. He's done that. In my opinion, he was very successful at that. The man who made that work is the guy on the right. That's Robert Lighthizer. He's the U.S. Trade Representative. And the USTR is responsible for negotiating and enforcing all the trade deals we have. He was a very hard scrabble negotiator, and he forced through deals with Korea, Japan, and Canada, and renegotiated NAFTA with Mexico in a way to take it forward in a way that both countries liked. But now that's done. It's over. Trump doesn't even have an ambassador in China any longer. And the Chinese made the fool of Trump with the Phase 1 deal. They violated that on day 2. That's not going to be forgiven. So expect zero positive progress on anything with the Chinese, on anything, before January 20. Longer term, the trade war with China was already destined to get worse. And a trade war with the Europeans is just around the corner. Which brings us to President-elect Biden. Biden's Buy America plan will accelerate and will deepen trade conflicts with both China and Europe. In the long run, these trade wars will work out great for you because they'll contribute to the smashing of the European subsidy system. But the long run isn't next year. You're talking 2022 and beyond. Now, Biden says, we'll find out for sure, but he says he wants to launch no new trade talks. So that means he doesn't need a negotiator in the USTR's office. What he wants to do is force a Buy American program. So if there's a product out there that has an American producer or a foreign producer, price is irrelevant. You have to go with the American one. That's what the government's going to do. That's what he's going to try to force on private enterprise. That's going to clash with everyone. So what he needs is not a negotiator. What he needs is a trade lawyer to sue everybody. And that's the woman on the left. That's Catherine Tai. She was negotiated to be Lighthizer's replacement just this morning. Now, Tai has zero experience in trade negotiations, but the only trade talks she's going to have to manage are the ones with the United Kingdom, and that one's going to be really easy. Now, for you, this is the best and the worst of all worlds. Best in that Tai will sue anyone for you and establish market access forcibly. Worst in that agriculture is by far the most internationalized of all U.S. economic sectors. So in her suing of others for non-agricultural sectors of the U.S. system, agriculture is the obvious choice for any country to retaliate. expect an extraordinarily bumpy 2021. Okay, that's a lot. If you're looking for the books, here they are. Follow me on Twitter or sign up for the newsletter, which is 100% free. I've started doing video logs while hiking, which I'm having a lot of fun with. But that is that, and I will take whatever questions you guys have.
Sure. Thanks a lot, Peter. A lot to keep in mind there, obviously, and good insights. So before we start our Q&A session, I just wanted to note for our participants that at the end of our program today, there will be a survey that'll pop up saying that when you're leaving the WebEx event, you may get an error page. It's not a malicious link or anything like that. We just want your thoughts about today's program specifically, but it also includes a number of market research questions that we would typically ask during the Ag Outlook events. If you already completed these questions in one of our previous sessions, you won't be asked to complete them again, but we would still request your quick feedback about today's program specifically. Your input helps us ensure our programming remains relevant and helpful to you. So let's get started on our Q&A. We've received a number of questions both in the chat box and through our registration process. So first question that came in was, how will the U.S. trade deficit affect the ag industry in the future? Do you see the U.S. dollar remaining the world reserve currency? And what effect will demographics have on GDP growth both in the United States and globally?
Okay, that's 3 questions. Let me start with the last one and work my way back. Demographics mean that the United States is going to remain one of the very few consumption economies in the world, even without immigration. We are aging very slowly compared to everybody else. We became younger than the average Chinese 2 years ago. We're going to become younger than the average Brazilian in about 20 years, and we're going to even be younger than the Mexicans in about 35. So we are the new kids on the block, and we're going to stay the new kids on the block, and that means the economic laws that we're used to, supply, demand, that sort of thing, crazy ideas, pretty much hold here. We're going to watch that break down around the world, and that's going to generate a surge of money and skilled labor into the United States, which hopefully we'll be able to assimilate culturally. I have high hopes, but it is going to be a messy ride. In terms of the U.S. dollar, there's nowhere else to go. The European system is doomed, and the euro stopped being a store of value about 10 years ago when they started having their banking crises and confiscating the bank deposits that were in the banks to pay for the bailouts. That meant that anyone who could get their money out of the Eurozone did, and it's now purely a regional currency. The Chinese yuan is not convertible, and every time they try, $1 trillion flees the country, so they've stopped trying. The Japanese yen went through the same process in the 80s. They're not interested. And because of Brexit, the pound isn't even considered a store of value. So it's the U.S. dollar or nothing. And no matter what we do with the deficit, we're stuck being the global currency. Now, the only part of this that is potentially bad for you is it means that your expenses are in U.S. dollars and everybody else has kind of a hybridized system where some things are dollars and other things are not. But remember, if the global system breaks down, oil, natural gas, those are 2 of the things that are wholly not denominated in U.S. dollars, and they're going to become harder to get. And it's going to be more expensive to get them everywhere else in the world, and it's going to be U.S. dollar denominated. So everyone else in the world is going to face some sort of input supply chain crisis that will never go away, and you won't. So you will have short-term competitors who will pop up and then fade away, but you're going to have very, very, very few long-term competitors. Now, the ones that are there are worth noting. Argentina and France are going to be competing in everything. The Kiwis are going to be a huge challenge when it comes to dairy. But really, that's about it. Everyone else just isn't going to be a reliable competitor. So we're going to see global food supplies crater, and you can imagine what that's going to do for prices.
Interesting. Good thoughts, Peter. So shifting gears a little bit here, can the Republicans claim the mantle of fiscal responsibility?
Yeah, no. Sorry. That boat has sailed. The Trump administration was running the biggest post-war deficits in our history before coronavirus, and the fiscal conservatives, people like me, we are completely politically homeless now. So I would love to think that they would come back, but if without the national security or the business voters, I don't think that coalition is in play. And we all know that the Democrats' math is not at their really forte either. So fiscal conservatives, as we know them, are in the wind, and they're just going to vote for whoever comes up with the least egregious spending plans. This time around, that was a coin flip.
Fair enough. Are you bullish or bearish on sub-Saharan Africa in the new global reality going forward?
Both. The geography is very difficult. A lot of desert, a lot of plateaus, a lot of cliffs, a lot of jungle. It's very hard to develop. And the growth we've seen economic growth we've seen in sub-Saharan Africa in the last 10 years is largely because the global baby boomer cadre is nearing retirement and they have a lot more money to invest, and some of that has made it to Africa. And that's helped with infrastructure, and that's helped with debt, and that has helped with consumption. But that all goes away in the next couple of years. So anything that is not completed in the next few years stops. Now, there are some pockets of sub-Saharan Africa that have better geography that are probably going to do pretty well. I'm bullish for Nigeria and South Africa, Angola, Kenya, Uganda, maybe Senegal. But those areas combined are only about a third of the population of the continent, and they are definitely not integrated with one another. So there's individual stories in Africa that are really positive, but the overall sub-Saharan African story is pretty bleak.
Okay. Do you see America stepping away from fracking and giving up our energy independence, as some on the left would like to see?
No, and remember, the socialists got gutted in the primaries and especially in the election process, and Biden has never said anything negative about fracking. The only thing that Biden has said that he wants to do with, there's two things he says he wants to do. One, he wants to restrict fracking on public lands, but that's less than 1% of shale oil and gas production, so that's not even a rounding error. And second, he wants the industry to take a stronger stance and have more procedures in place for limiting methane leakage, which honestly the industry should have done 10 years ago and is a really good idea and would actually save everybody a lot of money in the long run. So, I mean, I don't consider that an anti-energy position. Keep in mind that it was under Obama that the shale revolution quadrupled output. It's not that Biden had a lot to do with that, but if he had an ideological bone to pick with the energy sector, he would have made it that very apparent long before now. So no, I don't expect that to happen. He will be putting forward a lot more subsidies for wind and solar power and long-range power transmission, but honestly, long-range power transmission, that's going to benefit the shale sector more than it is the green sector, because there's natural gas in a lot of places like North Dakota that can't be brought to market. Well, if you run a power line to Chicago and Boise, now it can.
Sure. Right now, there's a lot of problems with the ag export logistics supply chain. Do you think this will continue since we're going to be the biggest consumer market going forward? That is a
question. When you're talking export infrastructure, you're talking about getting out of Seattle, and you're talking about getting out of Astoria and getting down to New York. I'm sorry, not New York, California. That problem is not going to go away. That is an infrastructure question. That is a local politics question, and local politics are forever. So for producers in your region, you've got two challenges. Number one, China's going to fall off the map one way or another. And two, to get the sort of diversified export set that you need in order to be stable, you need more than one export corridor. So solving the infrastructure issue in the Pacific Northwest obviously is a healthy step in that direction, but honestly it's insufficient. It's not just going to be you. The Canadian prairie provinces and BC are facing very similar issues. You're competing for the same markets. So moving forward, I realize that you're on the wrong side of the country, but I can't say this enough. Mexico, 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 Mexico. It's upwardly mobile. It's growing. It's industrializing, and their agricultural system sucks. You guys know how difficult it can be to grow food in the mountains or in deserts. Well, in Mexico, they have a choice between deserts, mountains, jungles, or usually a combination of the three. It's awful. It's high cost, it's low quality, and they're hungry, and they like American food. And you just need to get there. Now, you can only do so much with trucks. You need to get it to the water. There's no quick fix there. But one big piece of hope. The shale revolution has now progressed to the point that a lot of pipelines have been built, and they don't need all the rail cars that they used to use to transport the oil to market, which means it's now available for agricultural shipments at a lower cost. So you guys do have the option of railing to different places. And I realize it's the long way to go, but if you can rail to the Quad Cities and get to near the head of navigation of the Mississippi, or even just rail all the way down to Houston and then ship it on, that's probably your best bet moving forward at this point if you're looking for something that is going to really turn the page in the next 24 months.
Okay. What things are you seeing or can comment on about how the big box retails are putting a pricing squeeze on small farms?
It's not going to go away. One of the things that we have seen during coronavirus is a consolidation within the sector. You know, mom and pop groceries just aren't doing as well. They can't pay for the health upgrades. They don't have the variety. They're not one-stop shops. The big boxes are. The only way that that is going to change is lobbying the hell out of Washington. And with the business community in flux, and with the business community no longer strongly rooted in one political party, now might actually be the time for movement there. Because if you can get to the populace of the Republicans or to the kind of the rank and file of the Democrats and get them to push the business community before the business community is re-entrenched politically, you have more leverage. But timing will be very important there. 2021 is absolutely the year to push on that.
Mm-hmm. What's your biggest advice to farmers to prepare for 2021?
Mexico works differently than most places. The centralized government isn't nearly as powerful, and most deals that matter are done at the state and even at the urban level. You need to make friends of people south of the border. And if you don't know how to do that or you find it intimidating, make friends of a Texan. They will walk you through the process. The Texans have been working hand in hand with the Mexicans now for upwards of 40 years, and it's been a very productive relationship on both sides of the border, particularly with the northern communities. But there's no one in the Mexican government who thinks that they can be self-sufficient in foodstuffs, particularly as the country is growing and becoming more wealthy and buying more and better foods. But that, in terms of kind of midterm goals, is something that has to be on your horizon. Looking forward a little bit more, if you don't have a footprint in Southeast Asia, it's time to consider how to get one. Vietnam and Indonesia are probably the two countries that are going to matter most to you. They have the biggest populations and they're growing the fastest. But don't neglect the more advanced countries like Thailand or Malaysia. They're growing pretty much gangbusters as well.
Okay. Do you anticipate taxes going up significantly under the new administration?
Well, see, that's a good question. We don't know. Because the fiscal conservatives are out of the political system for the moment, the people who say we have to balance the budget are just kind of gone. We know what that means under the populist Republicans. It means run as big of a deficit as you want. In terms of the Democratic Party, because the socialists have been melon scooped out, that might actually be the more fiscally responsible party right now, maybe, which I know just kind of seems ass backwards to all of us, but that's the world we're in right now. But no, I don't expect significant tax increases. As a fiscal conservative, I'm like, of course we need to have tax increases. I mean, we got to pay for the retirement of the boomers. We've got these green transformation. We've got to deal with COVID. But, you know, like I said, we lost. We're not in the system anymore. So I would expect a Trump-level deficit for at least the first 2 years of the Biden administration without any serious talk about tax increases. Remember that the Republicans gained seats in the House, and they still have a thin control of the Senate. So any meaningful budget has to have at least some Republican support, and I think that if you remove tax increases from the math, that will be easier.
Okay. We're going to shift gears again on you. In the tree fruit industry, we've become quite reliant on the H-2A program for harvest and increasingly non-harvest labor. How long will Mexico remain a viable source of work visa labor based on demographics and economic development? Also, what should we, as growers and packers, be pushing for in terms of H-2A program modifications at the federal level to make it more workable for the industry?
I think you guys need to move beyond the H-2A, but let me talk about the Mexicans first. Mexico is experiencing the same population drop-off that every developed country in the world has to this point. When you industrialize and urbanize, people move into the cities and they have fewer kids. It's just in Mexico that didn't start until the mid-90s, as opposed to Germany where it started in 1900. So they peak migration from Mexico to the United States was in 2006. It's been down every year since. In fact, net migration from Mexico has now been negative for 10 years. It will never be net positive again. So Mexico, honestly, is no longer a net source. You're still going to be able to get people, particularly from southern Mexico, but the numbers are going to drop every year, so you need to start looking at further abroad. Central America, same thing. It's just that their urbanization process started in the year 2000, so you've got 5 more years there. But again, you're going to get waves of people from like hurricanes, but you're never going to be able to tap the numbers that you had last year again. So there's kind of 3 things that you can do. Number 1, you can go after war refugees. It's not an H-2 program. That's going to be something else, and it's something you have to be very proactive in if that's what you feel you need to go to. Some of the folks in the dairy world are already kind of playing that card with mixed success because it's really hard to make the case to Republican populists that we need to bring in 100,000 Syrians, for example. But that's where the work is now. Second, you can move up market. You can figure out how to do more profits with less output, and that's getting into more niche products and more into processing and having a lot tighter cooperation between the producers of the raw material and the people who do the finished product. And that's half marketing, that's half capital, and that's half just being really freaking clever. And I realize that's 1.5, but that gives you an idea of how hard it is. So there's some hard math in there, but there's a good way to do it. A lot of fruit producers in the South do it. I mean, when you get a peach pie from Georgia, you know there's a certain panache to that. You guys need to work on establishing similar things like that. What was the third one? Oh, no, that was all 3. Yeah, we're good.
Okay. Thanks. Do you expect a new massive government spending program to help accelerate Biden's Buy American program?
Yeah, it's going to have to. We're going to have a bailout/recovery program for coronavirus probably within the first few weeks of the administration. And because everybody broadly agrees that we need something, I think that'll kind of put our collective best foot forward with the new Congress, which I'm hopeful for. And then, if you're talking about a nationalistic Buy American program, that's not going to be free. Some of it might take the form of outright product subsidies, but I really doubt it. I think it's going to be more direct government purchases. And then the U.S. government changing things like the tariff structure and some incentives to encourage production at home. And I think that's something that both parties can broadly get behind, too. So we've got a couple things right out of the gate for the new administration that hopefully will not be as politically contentious as the things we've been wrestling with in 2020. Now, reasons for hope. When coronavirus hit, Congress did more in 3 weeks than it had done in the previous 10 years. So we know even at our worst, we can make some of this stuff work. But we'll see, and we'll know soon.
Okay. We probably have time for last 2 questions here. One's probably easier for you to talk about than the other, but the first one is, excluding China and Japan, what is your opinion of the Pacific Rim economies? After we get past the pandemic, what potential black swan events pose the greatest risk?
People talk about the American national debt as getting out of control. Keep in mind that the Chinese have domestic private debt that has already proven non-performing, that is bigger in absolute terms by a factor of 3 than the American national debt. That's not a black swan. The Chinese called it gray rhino. It's like the landmine that we know is not just in the room, but is sitting in front of the front door that everybody has to step over every day. And sooner or later, someone's going to trim it, and the whole thing is going to come down. So we know that's going to happen. So the Chinese system will crash, whether it's Chinese politics, civil uprising, American trade policy, Chinese trade connections to the wider world, Chinese demographics, or Chinese debt. Any of those could do it. And all of them, oh my God. I know you said excepting China, but I just had to get that in there. Southeast Asia is a region to watch that I'm very bullish on, but it needs capital. So whenever we do have these sharp breaks in the globalized system, they're going to suffer immeasurably until such time as enough foreign, probably American, capital comes in to help restructure. We will get some help from Japan on that, by the way, and that will rewire the economics of the entire region. And it will end up better for everybody involved because they'll pick up pieces of the manufacturing supply chain system from the Chinese, for example. The Chinese can't do it. So this gets us all to a much better place, but they're going to have a financial crisis first, and they're going to have a trade crisis first, and they're going to have a processing and supply chain crisis first. This will probably work out best for U.S. ag compared to all the other sectors because when they have a processing and supply chain crisis, that's going to really hurt in the short term their ability to grow food to feed themselves. Enter you.
Right. Great insights. We've got a number of other questions that came in, but we're running out of time. So Peter has graciously offered to kind of follow up on those after the fact, and we'll get back to the folks that asked those questions for those that we didn't get to. So with that, Peter, we sure appreciate all your insights and things to think about here for sure. So one last question for you. Can you tell us a little bit about your latest book?
It's not done yet. I finished the first 4 chapters. I'm actually almost done with the ag chapter. But the title is Life After the End of the World. It's all about what happens to all the economic sectors in the aftermath of globalization and how what we consider normal reforms in a new shape.
Great. Sounds interesting. So I would encourage anyone else to look at and pick up Peter's previous books as well. So they're always very thought-provoking for sure. So before we wrap things up today, I wanted to make the participants aware of the other BMC events we have coming up. Next Thursday, December 17th, we have Dr. Ed Seafried's final macroeconomic and interest rate outlook for the year. These quick hit updates have been well received, and you won't want to miss the latest information going into the holiday season here. Then, after the holidays, hop on our Family Business Succession Workshop on January 7th to start the conversation and learn a step-by-step process for building your succession plan. For a more intensive and hands-on approach, register your family for our Family Business Succession Conference, which is held virtually this year. This conference takes place in 4 weekly sessions over the month of February with a focus on working together as a family to actually build your plan with support and opportunities to ask questions of our family business experts throughout the process. And finally, don't forget about our virtual Young Beginning and Small Producers Conference scheduled for January 13th through the 15th. This 3-day event focuses on building a strong foundation for long-term success, including learning the basics of building a strategic plan and setting priorities to help achieve your goals. Learn more and register for these events at northwestfcs.com/register. Again, if you missed one of our previous events, check out northwestfcs.com/recorded-webinars to listen to the recordings. Again, today we did record this event, and we will be following up with the recordings within the week following here as soon as that gets processed. Thank you for making time to join us today, and especially to Peter for providing your analysis and thoughts on the trade and geopolitical environment. Again, please give us your thoughts in the survey that will open following the event. We really do appreciate that feedback. This will conclude our session today. We hope to see you at another upcoming BMC event soon. Have a great day.
Take care, everyone.